Good afternoon, everybody. I played at the Wachusett Chess Club again this last Wednesday, as usual, and I was on board one in round 2 of the Martin Laine Memorial. I had the black pieces, and I was paired against Gary Brassard, rated 1800. He played d4, I played d5, and after his c4 I played e6, the Queen's Gambit declined. And he surprised me by trading immediately on d5. I took back with my e-pawn, and he played knight c3. And I think I didn't do a very good job of figuring out how to take advantage of the difference in move order. Normally in this position, white still has a pawn on c4 and black has a pawn on e6. And black plays knight f6 or bishop e7. But here, I'm thinking in hindsight, especially given the way the opening worked out in the game, that I should have played c6 right away. The reason I didn't is that I thought white might play e4, and then after d takes e4, knight takes e4. I wasn't sure I wanted this pawn on c6. But given that white has an isolated queen pawn, and that for that reason black's trying to control the d5 square, I think this pawn would be fine on c6. So maybe I should have done that. As things worked out in the game, I played bishop to e7, white played bishop to f4, and now what happens later on in the game is this bishop becomes a big pain in the butt along this h2 b8 diagonal. So I think in the future I will maybe play c6 and wait for white to decide what to do with his queenside bishop before I develop my kingside one. I played knight to f6, Gary played e3, and I played c6. c6 I think is an important move for black in this kind of position because he'd like to develop his light-squared bishop, but if that happens before c6 is played, queen b3 can sometimes be a giant pain in the butt, hitting b7 and putting more pressure on d5. Black has defensive options, but they're not very attractive. For example, b6 weakens the a4, e8 diagonal and the c-file. So I played c6 first. Gary played queen to c2, I think clearly intending to create a battery along this diagonal to attack my king once I get castled. I castled kingside, and Gary played h3. I guess this is the first move of his that I'm not a huge fan of, and that's because I think he should keep developing his kingside minor pieces, or start to develop his kingside minor pieces. h3 is a move you see often in the London system, but this is not quite that opening. Though I guess I can't formulate any better an argument than that. And this bishop is a pain in the butt on this diagonal, and makes me, or made me consider move after move playing bishop d6, which would have been a second move with the dark squared bishop. So perhaps h3 is fine. I played rook e8. I really wanted to develop the bishop on c8, but unfortunately Gary's queen was controlling f5 and his h3 pawn was controlling g4, another reason that h3 might have been a good move. And had I played bishop to e6, intending queen d7 and bishop f5, I wouldn't have gotten there because he would have played bishop d3, putting another attacker on that square. So I played rook e8, looking down the e-file and trying to set up a position in which I can take advantage of the fact that his king's still on e1. In particular, by capturing the bishop on f4 or the pawn on d4 without him being able to recapture. He played bishop to d3, a good move, and I played b6. As I mentioned a moment ago, it's hard to figure out what to do with the bishop on c8, and I suspected during the game that the move b6 was not a good one, with the idea to play bishop a6 and exchange the light squared bishops, because it weakens the c-file and the a6 square. Gary played knight f3, and I did play bishop a6, and this is where I was worried that white could just try to play bishop takes a6, knight takes a6, and queen a4, and then he's hitting the pawn on c6 and the knight on a6. And I was hoping that knight to b4, threatening to play knight d3 check, would give me enough counterplay, maybe followed by b5. But I had a little bit of a bad feeling when I saw this position over the board, so I don't think I'll aim to repeat it. Maybe better would be just sticking the bishop on b7, getting the rest of the pieces developed, putting a rook on c8 and my other knight on d7, and then playing c5. Gary castled kingside. I traded the bishops on d3, but even with this more favorable version, which doesn't cause me to end up with a knight on a6, after I play knight bd7, which I kind of have to in order to get my last minor piece developed, white has access to the undefended a6 square, and probably has a way to make use of it, though neither Gary nor I figured out exactly how during the game. The queen also looks at f5, which is a nice square. And I think it's clear at this point, by comparing the pieces and the pawn structure, that white is better. The queen is clearly better, and is controlling diagonals of the correct color given the bishops that are remaining on the board. The bishop on f4 is better than the one on e7, and with the ability to jump into e5 at a moment's notice, I think white's knights are better than black's too. So I resolved to try to... and the c-file now has a target on it, because my pawn's not on b7 anymore. So I resolved to trade a bunch of minor pieces and try to get into some kind of major piece endgame and equalize that way, and hopefully play better afterwards. Gary played rook a to c1, a scary looking move because it targets this undefended pawn on c6, and I played bishop to e8. Yeah, there were issues here for me. I kind of wanted to go knight f8 and then bring the knight out to g6 or e6, but the problem was that to do that I had to at least temporarily give up the e5 square. I really wanted to be able to capture a knight that showed up on that square. I also looked at the natural rook c8, which defends the c6 pawn. But the problem after that is that white will dive in with his queen, and it's not clear how I'm going to defend the a pawn, other than by moving the rook right back to a8. So I played bishop to f8, and my idea was that if white invaded with queen a6, I'd have time to play queen c8. Notice that back here I can't play queen c8 because of knight to b5, which takes advantage of the fact that black's c-pawn is pinned. And then after queen b7, knight to c7, which is protected by the bishop on f4, forks the rooks. So I played bishop f8, which was a move which slightly improves my position, but really just asks white to do something so that I can, so that it's more obvious to me where my pieces belong and how I'm going to equalize. Gary played knight to e5, which sort of forces my next move, because he's targeting the pawn on c6 now with two pieces, and I don't have it defended at all. And as I mentioned earlier, my pieces are worse than his, so I'd like to trade off. And for those reasons, I played knight takes e5. D takes e5 was an option, but it makes the bishop on f4 look not very good, and that pawn might just be a target on that square. So Gary retook with his dark squared bishop. And after having resisted it for a while, I finally played bishop to d6, which is yet another move with that dark squared bishop, but one which gets rid of white's best minor piece, and continues on the road to trading the minors, looking toward an equal major piece endgame. Alright, and here Gary made a move that I think was a mistake. I think if he wants to take one of the black pieces, it should be the bishop on d6. And after queen takes d6, we have an equalish kind of late middle game or endgame. Instead, he took on f6. And the problem with this is that after queen takes f6 is in the game, the black bishop on d6 is going to be better than the white knight on c3. In fact, significantly better as far as I'm concerned. There are pawns left on both sides of the board, which is good for the bishop, and this diagonal, b8 to h2, previously occupied by white's very strong dark squared bishop, will now be used by black's, which in combination with the queen will create a checkmate threat. Gary played knight e2. I thought at first when he traded on f6 that his idea was to go e4 here, and I was going to play d takes e4, knight takes e4, and then either queen g6 or queen f5, pinning the knight to the queen, expecting a rook fe1 in response. I'm not sure I had a move planned here, but I just kind of hoped that the pin along this diagonal would mean I'd find some way to continue here that was better for me. Instead, he played knight e2. I played rook a to c8, finally defending this c-pawn now that it's directly attacked by the rook. He played king to h1, which I didn't understand at the time, but understood a move later. I played bishop to b8 with the idea to move the queen to d6 and create a battery. Gary played knight g1, and now it's clear that he was freeing that square so that his knight could use it to get to the f3 square. I played queen to d6, threatening queen h2, and he played knight f3, defending that square. But if we look at this position compared to the one that existed in the early middle game, I think it's pretty clear that the tables have turned. White was clearly better and is now, in my opinion, clearly worse. Black will play c5 and will have a bunch of space in the center and on the queen side, has the better minor piece, has both rooks developed, and the queens are about equal. And the white king is a little bit weaker. I played c5 immediately. Gary played d takes c5, and after b takes c5, we have a formation known as the hanging pawns. Not to be confused with a hanging pawn, which is a pawn which is undefended. The hanging pawns are two pawns on neighboring files, both of which are half open. So the opponent has a direct file on which to attack both pawns. And neither pawn can be defended by a pawn on one of the other neighboring files, in this case the b file and the e file. So they're a little bit weak, but they generate a lot of space for the person who has them, and I think they're just kind of considered a double-edged pawn formation. Gary played rook f to d1, putting more pressure on e5, which forced my response, rook e to d8, defending it. And I think white at some point here should try to take over the light squares by playing e4. I don't know when exactly it's possible. I don't think it works here because after d takes e4, it looks like black's holding on to this extra pawn, or we're ending up in... No, this is probably just bad. Queen takes d1, rook takes d1, rook takes d1, check. Okay, so I don't think white would do that. But the only alternative is to trade on d6 or move the queen away, in which case it looks like black's holding this e5 pawn, e4. But he should have found some point at which to play that move, because otherwise these pawns just control way too much space in the center, which means the black pieces have more flexibility of movement, which leads to it being easier for black to generate threats, which is bad news for white. He played king g1, and I played h6. I don't think that either of the pawn advances here makes any sense. d4 allows white to leave black with an isolated d-pawn, and c4 gives up the d4 square to the white pieces. Not to mention that d4 gives up e4 and c4. So I think black has an edge, but it's important to remember that having an advantage in chess doesn't necessarily mean you have a way to immediately burst through your opponent's position and win the game. You have to make small improving moves sometimes and convert your advantage in the long run. I played h6 to give the king some breathing room, and you might say, well, that's not actually breathing room because it's covered by the queen on d3, but that queen won't necessarily be there in the future. So this is just a long-term way to try to keep the black king from getting in trouble in the back rank. Gary played b3, a very common move against the hanging pawns, because you want to keep them from being advanced advantageously. So it's good to take your pawns on the neighboring files and advance them so they control the squares right in front of the hanging pawns. I played queen b6. There's something to mention here. The white queen is currently better than the black queen, and is looking at the f5 and b5 squares. And the trouble I was running into when I was calculating is that whenever I brought my queen to one side, I thought white would just move his queen to the other side, and the white queen would still be better than the black one. So I could move my queen over to b6 to start to maneuver it into the queen side and try to generate threats, but then his queen would come to f5, and maybe his knight would come to e5, or I guess that those are the only two pieces that can attack. But I thought his queen looked kind of menacing over there, and I could go the other direction, put my queen somewhere on the king side, but then he'd play queen b5 and start causing problems on the queen side. So I came up with the idea to go one way, to get his queen to go the other way, and then to come back and offer a queen trade. So I did that. I played queen b6, and after Gary's queen f5, I played queen e6. The idea here is either Gary trades on e6, in which case the resulting pawn structure is better for black than a hanging pawns formation. In fact, I think you could just say that black keeps his extra space and loses the vulnerability he has when he has hanging pawns. But if white retreats the queen, for example to d3, then black has effectively gotten the move queen e6 for free. Gary chose to trade on e6. I played f takes e6. And now these pawns are nowhere near as weak as they were a moment ago. They are supported by the pawn on e6. Black has a nice center, much more space, a better minor piece. Because of the ease of movement of the black king, we'll soon have a better king. g3 from Gary. Not entirely sure why he played that. I think it's because he wanted to, at some point, bring his king out into the center of the board. I played king f7. Gary played king g2, and I played king f6. So now the black king is better than the white one, which adds to black's list of small advantages. But I couldn't figure out how to make use of those advantages yet, so I thought, why not add to that list? And the way I thought of to do that is to also, I have extra space in the center and a little bit on the queen side, but why not take even more space on the queen side and take space on the king side? And then find some way to use all this extra space to win something. Gary played king h2. I think he's a little bit out of ideas here because he started moving his king from h2 to g2 to h2 to g2. So I continued with my idea. I played g5. He played king g2. I played a5. And he finally made a pawn move here in g4. It's in a way principled because it locks my pawns on dark squares when I have a dark squared bishop. But it also weakens the dark squares around the white king, which is still of value because there are some heavy pieces left on the board. If a rook ever shows up on the h-file and can invade with the assistance of the bishop on b8, white will regret playing g4. I played bishop a7. I was looking for a way to make progress here. I had already taken space on the king side in the center and on the queen side. I thought, well, maybe I can go rook h8 and h5 and try to do something on the king side. But I was a little worried that that my pawns were too vulnerable in the center, I think. Let's see, what was I worried about? As usual, I don't remember. I was also worried that white can just stick his own rooks on the h-file after these trades and that the rooks might just get traded off and I might not have anything after that. I don't think that's true because I think the pawn structure is better for black. But why not keep all the advantages I have, including the potential attack on the white king with the black rooks. I played bishop a7 with the idea, for that reason, instead to play rook to b8 and maybe rook b4 and maybe a4 and start kind of chipping away at white's structure and creating weaknesses. Gary played rook c2. I should mention that he was pretty low on time by this point, and the game went another 30 moves, I think. So by the end of the game, he was extremely low on time. I played rook to b8, intending rook b4. Gary played rook d to c1. And now I strongly considered h5 because it's no longer as easy for him to get his rooks to the h-file. But I thought, why not put this rook on b4 first, so that after h5 I'm threatening h takes g4, h takes g4, rook takes g4, check. This also supports a4. And I guess at this point, the combination of the time pressure and the positional pressure led Gary to want to make his position easier to play by sacrificing an exchange. So he played rook takes c5, I played bishop takes c5, and he played rook takes c5. Unfortunately, he only gets one pawn for the exchange, and the remaining pieces really favor black. But the defense he put up was an extremely good one. I played a4, of course, because this pawn was under attack. Why not advance it and start to break down these pawns and maybe win the remaining one? Gary played knight d4, defending his pawn on b3. I captured on b3, and he captured back. Rook to b6. I should mention that I played a takes b3, and only then realized that he was threatening knight c6, a move I hadn't even seen. But luckily it turns out that that would lose on the spot to b2, because the white rook can't get back to defend against b1 queen. So here I finally played rook b6 to stop the white knight from using the c6 square, at least as a fork. In fact, I think it stops white from using that square altogether because of rook c8, which should win something. Gary played rook c7, though, and his pieces are pretty active. The b-pawn is a target, but the problem is it's defended by the white knight on d4, and I can't take the b3 pawn no matter how many times I attack it unless I'm willing to give back an exchange, but at that point the game's going to be pretty drawish. I can kick the white knight off of d4, which would allow me to win the b3 pawn, but that will invite the knight into the f5 square when that knight and the rook on c7 might coordinate well against the black king. So I really wasn't sure what to do here and ended up maneuvering around for a long time. I also maneuvered around for a long time because white was under severe time pressure, so why not make him make a bunch of decisions when he has no time to do that? Played rook e8. Gary played rook h7. I played king g7, and he brought his rook back to c7. But this was pretty awkward for me. Trying to find a way to get this knight off of d4, but not allow it into f5, and maybe play h5 myself and then launch an attack on the h-file, but didn't know exactly how to do that. And in a bunch of the variations I was calculating, white's rook ended up on the h-file instead of mine because my king was on f6 or something. So I kept calculating, and maneuvering my pieces around, just trying to either get Gary to make a mistake or finally find a sequence of moves that allowed me to make use of my extra exchange. I played h5 here. Gary played rook c3. I took on g4, he took back, and I played rook h8. Gary came right back in with rook c7. Pretty tough defense on his part. I played rook h4, attacking the g-pawn. He said no problem, moved his king up to g3. I played rook h1, pretending to threaten to go to the queen side with the rook, but he just played king g2 and invited me to do that. And at this point I calculated and I think realized that it's just not worth it to move the rook over there. There would have been problems if I had done that. Let's just put the rook somewhere on this side of the board. Because white could have gone to attack my e-pawn, and when I defended it with my king, could have taken over the h-file, and then could have come up with rook h6 check and counterplay, and that's not what I want from this position. So I came back to h4. Gary played king g3 again, and I said, okay, I dove in and pretended I had threats, but I didn't really. So I brought my rook back to h8. But this is a very important idea in chess. You should, when you have a better position, and when your opponent has nothing he can do in that position that will significantly change its nature, you should make threats. Get your opponent to react to them, and then you can kind of go back to the original position and make a different set of threats. And you do this not necessarily because the first set of threats is unmeetable, but because in his quest to defend against your first set of threats, your opponent might blunder. Gary played king g2, I played king f6, and now my idea was to stick the king on e5 to protect it from checks. Gary played rook a7, but I had to play rook g8 first, because had I just played king to e5, the white rook would have shown up on g7 and hit this g5 pawn. Rook to c7, rook to g7, trying to eject the white rook. Gary stayed inside the black position, which I think makes sense, rook c8, but I played king e5. Okay, I thought I'm making progress here, which is great. And at some point I'd like to just move my king back to d6, start controlling c-file squares. Maybe that will cause the ejection of the white rook, and then with the white rook no longer inside my camp, maybe my rooks can go on offense and I can do something. But Gary played rook e8, at which point I realized king d6 just drops the pawn on e6. So I played the really awkward rook g6, defending the e-pawn from the other side. Gary played rook c8, and finally I was able to play king d6, taking control of c7, c6, and c5. And Gary reacted to that by moving his rook all the way back to c2. This is another major point in the game, I think, because Black's advantage gets enhanced here. White got a lot of counterplay, having his rook and his knight making threats in the black position. But after my rook g8, there are no more entry squares for the white rook. Gary played rook c1, I played king d7, having my king do all the work. Gary played king to f3, I played rook h8, and he played king to g3. Otherwise, there may have been a rook h3 check or a rook h2 at some point. Rook b4 from me. I wanted to stick this rook on h4 and this rook on b4 and create threats against the g4 pawn, which would be realized when I played e5, kicking the knight away. I thought rook b4 was the correct first move. It gives up c6, so white can put a piece there now, but if he puts the knight there, I will take his pawn on b3, and if he puts the rook there, he is threatening the e6 pawn. Oh, but I would just play rook takes d4, it looks like, and win material. So he played rook to c3 to defend his pawn on b3 a second time. I played rook h1. Could have played rook h4 directly, intending e5, but it kind of looked like I could just get there with tempo. So I played rook h1 with the idea that Gary would play king g2, and then I'd play rook h4 attacking the g-pawn. He would come back up, and then I would play e5 and grab the pawn on g4. But I missed something here, which Gary pointed out to me after the game, and that's that white gets some serious counterplay with knight f3. The pawn on g5 is indefensible. On top of that, there's no rook h4 attacking the g4 pawn a second time because the knight also guards that square. And there's no rook g1 check because the knight's got that covered as well. Looking at this after the fact, I think it's still decent for black though, because if white ever grabs that pawn on g5, rook g1 check will then pick up the g-pawn. On top of that, this rook could just swing over to b3, and black could grab the pawn on b3 in exchange for the one on g5. White's getting closer to a draw here, but this should still be winning for black. Instead, Gary played king g2, which is what I was looking for. So I played rook h4, he came back to defend his g-pawn, and I played e5. Knight f5 from white, but now a white pawn falls. Rook h takes g4 check. Gary played king f3, and I played rook g1. White doesn't have any threats. Black has equalized the pawn count. There are a lot more open files and ranks than there were before. The white knight has no outposts, so black should win here. Gary was super low on time at this point, though, and made a big mistake here with rook t3. So I played e4 check, and he resigned. A very long game, and an interesting one, and a very tough defense by Gary after giving up the exchange. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll be back with my game from this next Wednesday.